9. The orbital and the nuclear. The apotheosis of simulation, the nuclear. However, the balance of terror is never anything but the spectacular slope of a system of deterrence that has insinuated itself from the inside into all the cracks of daily life. Nuclear suspension only serves to seal the trivialized system of deterrence that is at the heart of the media, of the violence without consequences that reigns throughout the world, of the aleatory apparatus of all the choices that are made for us. The most insignificant of our behaviors is regulated by neutralized, indifferent, equivalent signs, by zero-sum signs like those that regulate the strategy of games, but the true equation is elsewhere, and the unknown is precisely that variable of simulation which makes of the atomic arsenal itself a hyperreal form, a simulacrum that dominates everything and reduces all ground-level events to being nothing but ephemeral scenarios, transforming the life left us into survival, into a stake without stakes, not even into a life insurance policy, into a policy that already has no value. It is not the direct threat of atomic destruction that paralyzes our lives, it is deterrence that gives them leukemia. And this deterrence comes from that fact that even the real atomic clash is precluded like the eventuality of the real in a system of signs. The whole world pretends to believe in the reality of this threat. This is understandable on the part of the military. The gravity of their exercise and the discourse of their strategy are at stake, but it is precisely at this level that there are no strategic stakes. The whole originality of the situation lies in the improbability of destruction. Deterrence precludes war, the archaic violence of expanding systems. Deterrence itself is the neutral, implosive violence of metastable systems or systems in involution. There is no longer a subject of deterrence, nor an adversary nor a strategy. It is a planetary structure of the annihilation of stakes. Atomic war, like the Trojan War, will not take place. The risk of nuclear annihilation only serves as a pretext, through the sophistication of weapons, a sophistication that surpasses any possible objective to such an extent that it is itself a symptom of nullity, for installing a universal security system, a universal lockup and control system whose deterrent effect is not at all aimed at an atomic clash, which was never in question, except without a doubt in the very initial stages of the Cold War, when one still confused the nuclear apparatus with conventional war, but, rather, at the much greater probability of any real event, of anything that would be an event in the general system and upset its balance. The balance of terror is the terror of balance. Deterrence is not a strategy, it circulates and is exchanged between nuclear protagonists exactly as is international capital in the orbital zone of monetary speculation whose fluctuations suffice to control all global exchanges. Thus the money of destruction, without any reference to real destruction, any more than floating capital has a real referent of production, that circulates in nuclear orbit suffices to control all the violence and potential conflicts around the world. What is hatched in the shadow of this mechanism with the pretext of a maximal, objective, threat, and thanks to Damocles' nuclear sword, is the perfection of the best system of control that has ever existed. And the progressive satellization of the whole planet through this hypermodel of security. The same goes for peaceful nuclear power stations. Pacification does not distinguish between the civil and the military, everywhere where irreversible apparatuses of control are elaborated, everywhere where the notion of security becomes omnipotent, everywhere where the norm replaces the old arsenal of laws and violence, including war, it is the system of deterrence that grows, and around it grows the historical, social, and political desert. A gigantic involution that makes every conflict, every finality, every confrontation contract in proportion to this blackmail that interrupts, neutralizes, freezes them all. No longer can any revolt, any story be deployed according to its own logic because it risks annihilation. No strategy is possible any longer, and escalation is only a puerile game given over to the military. The political stake is dead, only simulacra of conflicts and carefully circumscribed stakes remain. The space race played exactly the same role as nuclear escalation. This is why the space program was so easily able to replace it in the 1960s, Kennedy/Khrushchev, or to develop concurrently as a form of peaceful coexistence. Because what, ultimately, is the function of the space program, of the conquest of the moon, of the launching of satellites if not the institution of a model of universal gravitation, of satellization of which the lunar module is the perfect embryo. Programmed microcosm, where nothing can be left to chance. Trajectory, energy, calculation, physiology, psychology, environment, nothing can be left to contingencies. This is the total universe of the norm. The law no longer exists. It is the operational immanence of every detail that is law. A universe purged of all thread of meaning, in a state of asepsis and weightlessness. It is this very perfection that is fascinating. The exaltation of the crowds was not a response to the event of riding on the moon or of sending a man into space. This would be, rather, the fulfillment of an earlier dream. Rather, we are dumbfounded by the perfection of the programming and the technical manipulation, by the imminent wonder of the programmed unfolding of events. Fascination with the maximal norm and the mastery of probability. Vertigo of the model, which unites with the model of death, but without fear or drive. Because if the law, with its aura of transgression, if order, with its aura of violence, still taps a perverse imaginary, the norm fixes, fascinates, stupefies, and makes every imaginary involute. One no longer fantasizes about the minutiae of a program. Just watching it produces vertigo. The vertigo of a world without flaws. Now, it is the same model of programmatic infallibility, of maximum security and deterrence that today controls the spread of the social. There lies the true nuclear fallout. The meticulous operation of technology serves as a model for the meticulous operation of the social. Here as well, nothing will be left to chance. Moreover, this is the essence of socialization, which began centuries ago, but which has now entered its accelerated phase, toward a limit that one believed would be explosive, revolution, but which for the moment is translated by an inverse, implosive, irreversible process, the generalized deterrence of chance, of accident, of transversally, of finality, of contradiction, rupture, or complexity in a social idea illuminated by the norm. Doomed to the descriptive transparency of mechanisms of information. In fact, the spatial and nuclear models do not have their own ends, neither the discovery of the moon, nor military and strategic superiority. Their truth is to be the models of simulation, the model vectors of a system of planetary control, where even the superpowers of the scenario are not free, the whole world is satellized. *9 resist the evidence. In satellization, he who is satellized is not who one might think. Through the orbital inscription of a spatial object, it is the planet Earth that becomes a satellite, it is the terrestrial principle of reality that becomes eccentric, hyperreal, and insignificant. Through the orbital instantiation of a system of control like peaceful coexistence, all the terrestrial microsystems are satellized and lose their autonomy. All energy, all events are absorbed by this eccentric gravitation, everything condenses and implodes toward the only micromodel of control, the orbital satellite, as conversely, in the other, biological, dimension, everything converges and implodes on the molecular micromodel of the genetic code. Between the two, in this working of the nuclear and the genetic, in the simultaneous assumption of the two fundamental codes of deterrence, every principle of meaning is absorbed, every deployment of the real is impossible. The simultaneity of two events in the month of July 1975 illustrated this in a striking manner, the link-up in space of the two American and Soviet supersatellites, apotheosis of peaceful coexistence, the suppression by the Chinese of ideogrammatic writing and conversion to the Roman alphabet. The latter signifies the orbital instantiation of an abstract and modelized system of signs, into whose orbit all the once unique forms of style and writing will be reabsorbed. The satellization of language, the means for the Chinese to enter the system of peaceful coexistence, which is inscribed in their heavens at precisely the same time by the link-up of the two satellites. Orbital flight of the big two, neutralization and homogenization of everyone else on Earth. Yet, despite this deterrence by the orbital power, the nuclear or molecular code, events continue at ground level, misfortunes are even more numerous, given the global process of the contiguity and simultaneity of data. But, suddenly, they no longer have any meaning, they are no longer anything but the duplex effect of simulation at the summit. The best example can only be that of the war in Vietnam, because it took place at the intersection of a maximum historical and revolutionary stake, and of the installation of this deterrent authority. What meaning did this war have, and wasn't its unfolding a means of sealing the end of history in the decisive and culminating historic event of our era? Why did this war, so hard, so long, so ferocious, vanish from one day to the next as if by magic? Why did this American defeat, the largest reversal in the history of the USA, have no internal repercussions in America? If it had really signified the failure of the planetary strategy of the United States, it would necessarily have completely disrupted its internal balance and the American political system. Nothing of the sort occurred. Something else, then, took place. This war, at bottom, was nothing but a crucial episode of peaceful coexistence. It marked the arrival of China to peaceful coexistence. The non-intervention of China obtained and secured after many years, China's apprenticeship to a global modus vivendi, the shift from a global strategy of revolution to one of shared forces and empires, the transition from a radical alternative to political alternation in a system now essentially regulated, the normalization of Peking-Washington relations. This was what was at stake in the war in Vietnam, and in this sense, the USA pulled out of Vietnam but won the war. And the war ended spontaneously when this objective was achieved. That is why it was de-escalated, demobilized so easily. This same reduction of forces can be seen on the field. The war lasted as long as elements irreducible to a healthy politics and discipline of power, even a communist one, remained unliquidated. When at last the war had passed into the hands of regular troops in the north and escaped that of the resistance, the war could stop, it had attained its objective. The stake is thus that of a political relay. As soon as the Vietnamese had proved that they were no longer the carriers of an unpredictable subversion, one could let them take over. That theirs is a communist order is not serious in the end, it had proved itself, it could be trusted. It is even more effective than capitalism in the liquidation of savage and archaic pre-capitalist structures. Same scenario in the Algerian War. The other aspect of this war and of all wars today, behind the armed violence, the murderous antagonism of the adversaries, which seems a matter of life and death, which is played out as such, or else one could never send people to get themselves killed in this kind of thing, behind the simulacrum of fighting to the death and of ruthless global stakes, the two adversaries are fundamentally in solidarity against something else, unnamed, never spoken, but whose objective outcome in war, with the equal complicity of the two adversaries, is total liquidation. Tribal, communitarian, pre-capitalist structures, every form of exchange, of language, of symbolic organization, that is what must be abolished, that is the object of murder in war, and war itself, in its immense, spectacular death apparatus, is nothing but the medium of this process of the terrorist rationalization of the social, the murder on which sociality will be founded, whatever its allegiance, communist or capitalist. Total complicity, or division of labor between two adversaries, who may even consent to enormous sacrifices for it, for the very end of reshaping and domesticating social relations. The North Vietnamese were advised to countenance a scenario for liquidating the American presence in the course of which, of course, one must save face. This scenario, the extremely harsh bombardments of Hanoi. Their untenable character must not conceal the fact that they were nothing but a simulacrum to enable the Vietnamese to seem to countenance a compromise and for Nixon to make the Americans swallow the withdrawal of their troops. The game was already won, nothing was objectively at stake but the verisimilitude of the final montage. The moralists of war, the holders of high wartime values should not be too discouraged. The war is no less atrocious for being only a simulacrum, the flesh suffers just the same, and the dead and former combatants are worth the same as in other wars. This objective is always fulfilled, just like that of the charting of territories and of disciplinary socializing. What no longer exists is the adversity of the adversaries, the reality of antagonistic causes, the ideological seriousness of war. And also the reality of victory or defeat, war being a process that triumphs well beyond these appearances. In any case, the pacification, or the deterrence, that dominates us today is beyond war and peace, it is that at every moment war and peace are equivalent. War is peace, said Orwell. There also, the two differential poles implode into each other, or recycle one another, a simultaneity of contradictions that is at once the parody and the end of every dialectic. Thus one can completely miss the truth of a war, namely, that it was finished well before it started, that there was an end to war at the heart of the war itself, and that perhaps it never started. Many other events, the oil crisis, etc., never started, never existed, except as artificial occurrences, abstract ersatz, and as artifacts of history, catastrophes and crises destined to maintain a historical investment under hypnosis. The media and the official news service are only there to maintain the illusion of an actuality, of the reality of the stakes, of the objectivity of facts. All the events are to be read backward, or one becomes aware, as with the communists in power in Italy, the posthumous rediscovery of the gulags and Soviet dissidents like the almost contemporary discovery, by a moribund ethnology, of the lost difference of savages, that all these things arrived too late, with a history of delay, a spiral of delay, that they long ago exhausted their meaning and only live from an artificial effervescence of signs, that all these events succeed each other without logic, in the most contradictory, complete equivalence, in a profound indifference to their consequences, but this is because there are none, they exhaust themselves in their spectacular promotion, all newsreel footage thus gives the sinister impression of kitsch, of retro and porno at the same time, doubtless everyone knows this, and no one really accepts it. The reality of simulation is unbearable, crueler than Artaud's theater of cruelty, which was still an attempt to create a dramaturgy of life, the last gasp of an ideality of the body, of blood, of violence in a system that was already taking it away, toward a reabsorption of all the stakes without a trace of blood. For us the trick has been played. All dramaturgy, and even all real writing of cruelty has disappeared. Simulation is the master, and we only have a right to the retro, to the phantom, parodic rehabilitation of all lost referentials. Everything still unfolds around us, in the cold light of deterrence, including Artaud, who has the right like everything else to his revival, to a second existence as the referential of cruelty. This is why nuclear proliferation does not increase the risk of either an atomic clash or an accident, save in the interval when the young powers could be tempted to make a non-deterrent, real use of it, as the Americans did in Hiroshima, but precisely only they had a right to this use value of the bomb. All of those who have acquired it since will be deterred from using it by the very fact of possessing it. Entry into the atomic club, so prettily named, very quickly effaces, as unionization does in the working world, any inclination toward violent intervention. Responsibility, control, censure, self-deterrence always grow more rapidly than the forces or the weapons at our disposal. This is the secret of the social order. Thus the very possibility of paralyzing a whole country by flicking a switch makes it so that the electrical engineers will never use this weapon. The whole myth of the total and revolutionary strike crumbles at the very moment when the means are available, but alas precisely because those means are available. Therein lies the whole process of deterrence. It is thus perfectly probable that one day we will see nuclear powers export atomic reactors, weapons, and bombs to every latitude. Control by threat will be replaced by the more effective strategy of pacification through the bomb and through the possession of the bomb. The little powers, believing that they are buying their independent striking force, will buy the virus of deterrence, of their own deterrence. The same goes for the atomic reactors that we have already sent them, so many neutron bombs knocking out all historical virulence, all risk of explosion. In this sense, the nuclear everywhere inaugurates an accelerated process of implosion, it freezes everything around it, it absorbs all living energy. The nuclear is at once the culminating point of available energy and the maximization of energy control systems. Lockdown and control increase in direct proportion to, and undoubtedly even faster than, liberating potentialities. This was already the aporia of the modern revolution. It is still the absolute paradox of the nuclear. Energies freeze in their own fire, they deter themselves. One can no longer imagine what project, what power, what strategy, what subject could exist behind this enclosure, this vast saturation of a system by its own forces, now neutralized, unusable, unintelligible, non-explosive, except for the possibility of an explosion toward the center, of an implosion where all these energies would be abolished in a catastrophic process, in the literal sense, that is to say in the sense of a reversion of the whole cycle toward a minimal point, of a reversion of energies toward a minimal threshold. Asterisk notes asterisk 1. CFJ Baudrillard, L'Ordre de Simulacres, The Order of Simulacra, in L'échange symbolique et la mort, Symbolic Exchange and Death, Paris, Gallimard, 1976. 2. A discourse that is itself not susceptible to being resolved in transference. It is the entanglement of these two discourses that renders psychoanalysis interminable. 3. Cf. Emperniola, Icons, Visions, Simulacres, Icons, Visions, Simulacra, 39. 4. This does not necessarily result in despairing of meaning, but just as much in the improvisation of meaning, of non-meaning, of many simultaneous meanings that destroy each other. 5. Taken together, the energy crisis and the ecological mise en scene are themselves a disaster movie, in the same style, and with the same value, as those that currently comprise the golden days of Hollywood. It is useless to laboriously interpret these films in terms of their relation to an objective social crisis or even to an objective phantasm of disaster. It is in another sense that it must be said that it is the social itself that, in contemporary discourse, is organized along the lines of a disaster movie script. CFM. Macreus, La Stratégie de la Catastrophe, The Strategy of Disaster, 115. 6. To this flagging investment in work corresponds a parallel decline in the investment in consumption. Goodbye to use value or to the prestige of the automobile, goodbye amorous discourses that neatly oppose the object of enjoyment to the object of work. Another discourse takes hold that is a discourse of work on the object of consumption aiming for an active, constraining, Puritan reinvestment, use less gas, watch out for your safety, you've gone over the speed limit, etc., to which the characteristics of automobiles pretend to adapt. Rediscovering a state through the transposition of these two poles. Work becomes the object of a need, the car becomes the object of work. There is no better proof of the lack of differentiation among all the stakes. It is through the same slippage between the right to vote and electoral duty that the divestment of the political sphere is signaled. 7. The medium/message confusion is certainly a corollary of that between the sender and the receiver, thus sealing the disappearance of all dual, polar structures that form the discursive organization of language, of all determined articulation of meaning reflecting Jacobson's famous grid of functions. That discourse circulates is to be taken literally, that is, it no longer goes from one point to another, but it traverses a cycle that without distinction includes the positions of transmitter and receiver, now unlocatable as such. Thus there is no instance of power, no instance of transmission. Power is something that circulates and whose source can no longer be located, a cycle in which the positions of the dominator and the dominated are exchanged in an endless reversion that is also the end of power in its classical definition. The circularization of power, of knowledge, of discourse puts an end to any localization of instances and poles. In the psychoanalytic interpretation itself, the power of the interpreter does not come from any outside instance but from the interpreted himself. This changes everything, because one can always ask of the traditional holders of power where they get their power from. Who made you duke? The king. Who made you king? God. Only God no longer answers. But to the question, who made you a psychoanalyst? The analyst can well reply, you. Thus is expressed, by an inverse simulation, the passage from the analyzed to the analysed and, from passive to active, which simply describes the spiraling effect of the shifting of poles, the effect of circularity in which power is lost, is dissolved, is resolved in perfect manipulation. It is no longer of the order of directive power and of a gaze, but of the order of tactility and commutation. See also the state/family circularity assured by the fluctuation and metastatic regulation of the images of the social and the private. J. Donzelot, La Polista/Emils, the policing of families. Impossible now to pose the famous question, from what position do you speak? How do you know? From where do you get your power, without hearing the immediate response, but it is of you, from you, that I speak, meaning, it is you who are speaking, you who know, you who are the power. Gigantic circumlocution of the spoken word, which is equal to a blackmail with no end, to a deterrence that cannot be appealed of the subject presumed to speak, leaving him without a reply, because to the question that he poses one ineluctably replies, but you are the answer, or, your question is already an answer, etc., the whole strangulatory sophistication of intercepting speech, of the forced confession in the guise of freedom of expression, of trapping the subject in his own interrogation, of the precession of the reply to the question, all the violence of interpretation lies there, as well as that of the conscious or unconscious management of the spoken word parole. This simulacrum of the inversion or the involution of poles, this clever subterfuge, which is the secret of the whole discourse of manipulation and thus, today, in every domain, the secret of any new power in the erasure of the scene of power, in the assumption of all words from which has resulted this fantastic silent majority characteristic of our time, all of this started without a doubt in the political sphere with the democratic simulacrum, which today is the substitution for the power of God with the power of the people as the source of power, and of power as emanation with power as representation. Anti-Copernican revolution, no transcendental instance either of the sun or of the luminous sources of power and knowledge, everything comes from the people and everything returns to them. It is with this magnificent recycling that the universal simulacrum of manipulation, from the scenario of mass suffrage to the present-day phantoms of opinion polls, begins to be put in place. APPEP is an acronym for smallest possible gap, or plus petit écart possible. Trans. 9. Paradox, all bombs are clean, their only pollution is the system of security and of control they radiate as long as they don't explode.